My wife and I bought the house on Morrow Lane in late October. It was a foreclosure, priced way below market, and we told ourselves that was because of the economy. The realtor mentioned the previous owners had left suddenly, but she said it casually, like it was gossip and not a warning. The first few weeks were fine. We painted the living room, replaced the kitchen faucets, did all the normal stuff you do when you move into a fixer-upper. The neighborhood was quiet. Our nearest neighbor, an older woman named Donna, brought us a casserole and told us she was glad someone was finally living in the place again. She said it had been empty for almost 2 years. I asked her why the previous family left. She looked at me for a moment and said she didn't really know. Then she changed the subject. It started with the basement. I'm not someone who gets creeped out easily, but that basement bothered me from the beginning. It wasn't anything specific. The ceiling was low, the light was bad, and there was a smell I couldn't identify. Not rot exactly. Something stale and heavy, like the air itself had been sitting there too long. I went down there to check the water heater one evening and noticed marks on the concrete wall near the back corner. They looked like scratches at first, but when I got closer, I could see they were letters. Someone had carved words into the wall with something sharp. Most of it was illegible, worn down or too messy to read. But one phrase was clear enough. Don't sleep here. I showed my wife, Laura. She laughed it off, said it was probably kids messing around before we moved in. I wanted to agree with her, but the carving didn't look like something a kid would do. The letters were shaky but deliberate, pressed deep into the concrete. It must have taken real effort. About a month after we moved in, I started having trouble sleeping. I'd wake up in the middle of the night feeling like something was wrong, but I couldn't say what. The house would be silent. Laura would be asleep next to me. Nothing was out of place. But I'd lie there for an hour sometimes, staring at the ceiling, my heart going faster than it should have been. Then Laura started hearing things. She told me one morning over coffee that she'd woken up and heard what sounded like someone walking in the hallway. Not footsteps exactly, more like the floor creaking under weight, the way it does when someone shifts their stance. She'd gotten up and checked, but the hallway was empty. She said she stood there for a while and didn't hear it again. I told her it was the house settling. Old houses do that. She nodded, but I could tell she wasn't satisfied with the answer. It happened again the next night, and the night after that. Always in the hallway, always in the small hours. Laura stopped getting up to check. She said there was no point, because nothing was ever there. One night I heard it myself. I was lying awake, doing that thing where you stare at nothing and try to will yourself back to sleep. The sound came from the hallway, just outside our bedroom door. Slow, deliberate creaking, like someone was standing just on the other side of the door, rocking back and forth on their heels. I got up and opened the door fast, figuring if there was someone there I'd rather know. The hallway was dark and empty, but the air felt different, colder, and that smell from the basement was there, faint but unmistakable. That heavy, stale, closed-in smell. I stood in the hallway for maybe 5 minutes. Nothing happened. I went back to bed. Things got worse gradually. Laura started finding the basement door open in the mornings. We both swore we'd closed it the night before. I put a latch on it, one of those hook and eye things. It didn't help. The door would be open, the latch undone. I set up a camera in the hallway, one of those cheap motion-activated ones you can get at any hardware store. The first 2 nights it didn't capture anything. The third night, it recorded about 40 seconds of footage around 2 in the morning. The video showed the empty hallway, dimly lit by the nightlight we kept near the bathroom. Nothing moved. Nothing was there. But halfway through the clip, the basement door at the end of the hall slowly swung open. There was no wind. Nothing pushed it. It just opened on its own, smooth and steady, like someone was pulling it from the other side. I showed the video to Laura. She watched it twice and didn't say anything for a while. Then she asked me if I thought we should move. I didn't want to move. We'd sunk our savings into this house. We just started making it ours. And honestly, a door opening on its own isn't enough to make you uproot your entire life. You find reasons. Drafts, uneven floors, faulty latches. You explain it away because the alternative is something you can't deal with. So we stayed. The last week was the worst. Laura started talking in her sleep. She'd never done that before in the 8 years I'd known her. It wasn't mumbling either. She'd speak clearly, full sentences, but in a flat voice that didn't sound like her. I couldn't always make out what she was saying, but one night I woke up and she was saying, "He's still down there. He's still down there." Over and over, in that same flat monotone. I shook her awake and she looked at me, confused and scared. She didn't remember dreaming anything. She didn't know what I was talking about. The next day I went back down to the basement. I don't know what I was looking for. I stood near the wall where the words were carved and looked around. The smell was stronger than it had ever been. I noticed something I hadn't before. In the far corner, the concrete floor had a crack in it. Not a normal settling crack. It was too straight, too deliberate, forming a rough rectangle about 3 feet by 6 feet, like something had been cut into the floor and filled back in. I got on my knees and looked closer. The concrete inside the rectangle was a slightly different shade than the rest. Newer. Someone had cut a section of the floor out and poured fresh concrete over it. I didn't touch it. I didn't dig. I didn't do anything except stand up and walk upstairs and tell Laura we were leaving. We were out of the house within a week. I called the police before we left and told them what I'd found in the basement floor. I don't know what happened after that. They took my information and said they'd look into it. I never followed up. I didn't want to know. We rent an apartment now, downtown, 3rd floor of a building with thin walls and loud neighbors. I can hear everything through these walls. Televisions, conversations, kids running around. It should bother me, but it doesn't. The noise is a comfort. It means there are people around, living their lives, and everything making sound has a source I can point to. I still think about that basement sometimes, about the words carved into the wall, and the rectangle in the floor, and whatever Laura was talking about in her sleep. I think about the family that lived there before us, and how they left suddenly, and how Donna changed the subject when I asked about them. I don't think the house was haunted. I think something happened there, something real and terrible, and the house remembered it the way houses sometimes do. Not with ghosts or spirits, but with a kind of heaviness that seeps into the walls and the air and the ground. A wrongness that you feel in your body before your mind can name it. I never went back. I never will. I took the job at the grain elevator because it paid $4 more an hour than anything else in town. Simple as that. I was 23, broke, and my truck needed a new transmission. The job was night shift security, which really just meant sitting in a chair in the main office from 10 at night until 6 in the morning, watching monitors and doing a walkthrough of the facility every couple hours. The elevator sat about a mile outside of Harlan, right along the railroad tracks. During harvest season it was busy, trucks coming and going all day. But at night the place was dead. Just the building and the silos and the flat empty fields stretching out in every direction. The guy who trained me, Rick, told me the job was the easiest money I'd ever make. He said the hardest part was staying awake. He was right about that. The first couple weeks, boredom was the only problem. I'd bring books, listen to podcasts, sometimes just sit there staring at the monitors showing empty hallways and parking lots. The facility had maybe a dozen cameras, most of them pointed at doors and loading areas. The footage was grainy and washed out by those ugly industrial lights that make everything look the same shade of yellow. The walkthrough was the only part that felt like actual work. I had to go through the main building, check all the doors, then walk out to the silos and make sure nothing looked off. The main building was a big concrete box with offices on one end and the processing floor on the other. At night, with the machinery shut down, the processing floor was just this huge dark space full of conveyor belts and chutes and metal catwalks. My flashlight barely made a dent in it. I didn't like doing the walkthroughs, but not because I was scared. It was more that the building felt wrong at night. Everything was built for noise and movement, and when all of that stopped, the silence felt unnatural. Like holding your breath. About 3 weeks in, I noticed something on the cameras that I couldn't explain. It was during one of the stretches where I was just sitting in the office, half watching the monitors. Camera 6 covered a hallway on the second floor of the main building. I glanced at it and thought I saw someone standing at the far end of the hall. I looked closer, but the image was so grainy that I couldn't be sure. It could have been a shadow or a piece of equipment, or just the way the light was hitting the wall. I grabbed my flashlight and went up there. The hallway was empty. Nothing at the far end except a fire extinguisher and a door to a storage closet. I checked the closet. Cleaning supplies. I went back to the office and looked at the camera again. Whatever I thought I'd seen was gone. I told myself it was nothing and moved on. A week later it happened again. Same camera, same hallway. This time I was paying more attention, and I was almost sure I could see a figure standing at the end of the hall. It was dark, person-shaped, and completely still. I watched for a full minute and it didn't move. Then I blinked and it was gone. Not like someone walking away. Just there. And then not there. I went up again. Empty hallway, empty closet, same fire extinguisher. After that, I started paying a lot more attention to camera 6. Most nights I saw nothing unusual. But every few shifts, that shape would be there. Always at the far end of the hall. Always motionless. Always gone by the time I got upstairs. I mentioned it to Rick when he came in for the day shift one morning. He gave me this look, kind of annoyed, kind of amused, and said the cameras were old and the image quality was garbage, and I was probably seeing artifacts from the compression. He said the last night guy used to complain about the same thing, and that was why he quit. That last part caught my attention. I asked Rick why the previous night guy really left. Rick shrugged and said the guy just stopped showing up one day. Said he was unreliable anyway. I let it go, but I started keeping a log. Date, time, what I saw on camera 6. Over the next month, the figure appeared on maybe 8 or 9 occasions. Always the same spot, same posture, same disappearing act. I started taking photos of the monitor with my phone, but they never came out clear enough to show anything definitive. Just a dark blob at the end of a grainy hallway. Then one night the routine changed. I was doing my walkthrough around midnight, making my way through the processing floor with my flashlight. The place was its usual vast dark self, all metal and concrete and silence. I was walking along the main catwalk when I heard something below me. It was a scraping sound, metal on concrete, slow and irregular, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. I stopped and aimed my flashlight down through the grating of the catwalk. The floor below was cluttered with equipment, drums, pallets, all the usual stuff. I couldn't see anything moving. The sound stopped. I stood there for a long time, listening. Nothing. I finished the walkthrough faster than usual and went back to the office. The scraping happened again 2 nights later. Same area of the processing floor, same sound. This time I went downstairs to check. My flashlight swept across the floor and everything was still. But I noticed something. One of the 50-gallon drums near the far wall had moved. I was sure of it, because on my previous walkthrough, I'd noticed it was sitting right on a seam in the concrete. And now it was about 2 feet to the left of that seam. Those drums are heavy. Even empty, they're awkward. Full. You need equipment to move them. I checked around the drum. Nothing behind it, nothing under it. No marks on the floor. I went back upstairs and checked the cameras covering the processing floor. The footage was too dark and too far away to show anything useful. The last night I worked there was in early December. I was doing my walkthrough, same as always. I'd gotten through the main building and was heading outside to check the silos. It was cold, maybe 15 degrees, and the wind was coming across the fields hard enough that I had to lean into it. I checked the first 3 silos without any issues. The 4th silo was the one farthest from the main building, sitting at the edge of the property near the railroad tracks. When I got to it, the access door at the base was open. That door was always locked. I had the key on my ring and I hadn't unlocked it. Nobody should have been out there. I stood in front of the open door and pointed my flashlight inside. The silo was empty, between harvests, just a huge cylindrical space going up maybe 80 feet. The beam of my flashlight hit the far wall and the metal ladder that ran up the inside. The floor was bare concrete with a thin layer of grain dust. There were footprints in the dust. They started at the door and went straight to the ladder. Bare footprints, like someone walking without shoes, in 15-degree weather. I followed the footprints with my light. They led to the ladder, and then the prints were on the rungs, dusty partial prints going up. I tilted my flashlight upward, following the ladder into the darkness above me. Something was up there, maybe 30 feet up, clinging to the ladder. I couldn't make it out clearly because the light was shaking. My hands were shaking, but I could see enough. A shape, pale, not moving, pressed against the rungs the way a person would be if they were climbing, and then just stopped. It wasn't right, though. The proportions were off somehow. The limbs too long, the body too narrow. I stepped backward out of the silo. I pulled the door shut. I walked back to the main building at a pace that was almost running. I went into the office and sat down and stared at the monitors until the sun came up and Rick walked through the door. I told him the Silo 4 access door had been open. He frowned and said he'd check it out. I didn't mention the footprints or what I saw on the ladder. I knew how it would sound. I knew he'd tell me it was probably an animal or a trick of the light or my own exhaustion playing games. I finished my shift and drove home and called the office that afternoon and quit. The woman who answered asked if I wanted to give a reason. I told her I'd found another job. She said fine, and that was that. It's been about 5 years now. I still drive past the elevator sometimes on my way to my in-laws' place. It looks the same. It operates the same. Nobody's reported anything strange there as far as I know. Sometimes I wonder if whatever I saw is still there, waiting in the dark at the top of that silo, or if it was ever really there at all. But I remember the footprints. Bare feet in the grain dust, in the middle of December. That part I can't explain away. That part was real. We used to swim at Birch Lake every summer growing up. My family had a cabin there, one of about 15 places scattered along the south shore. It was the kind of lake that looks beautiful in photographs, but is actually sort of eerie when you're out on it. Deep water, dark water, the color of strong tea from the tannins. You couldn't see more than a foot or two below the surface, even on a sunny day. The lake was spring-fed and cold even in July. It dropped off fast from the shore, going from waist-deep to over your head in just a few steps. The old-timers said it was over 100 feet deep in the center, though I don't know if anyone ever actually measured it. There were stories about it, the way there are stories about every deep lake in that part of the country. Drownings, mostly. A family in the 60s. Some college kids in the 70s. My dad always made me wear a life jacket until I was 12. This happened the summer I was 16. My friend Casey was staying at the cabin with me for 2 weeks in August. We spent most of our time swimming, fishing, paddling around in the canoe. Normal stuff. Casey was a strong swimmer, better than me, and by that age we'd both gotten cocky about the lake. We'd swim out to the middle and tread water just to prove we could. Looking back, that was stupid. But you don't think about risk the same way at 16. One afternoon we decided to swim out to the raft. There was this old wooden platform that someone had anchored about 200 yards from our shore, back before I was born. It was nothing fancy, just a square of plywood on a frame of 2x4s, with some foam blocks underneath to keep it afloat. People used it for sunbathing. By the time I was 16, it was in rough shape, waterlogged and listing to one side, but it still floated. We swam out to it without any problems. It took maybe 10 minutes. We pulled ourselves up onto the raft and lay there catching our breath, looking up at the sky. The sun was starting to get low, and the lake was very still. No wind, no boats. The surface was like glass. Casey sat up and looked down into the water off the edge of the raft. He was quiet for a minute, and then he said, "Something just moved down there." I sat up and looked. The water was its usual dark self. I couldn't see anything. Casey said he'd seen something white, deep down, moving slowly under the raft. He said it was big, bigger than a fish. I told him it was probably just a light-colored rock on the bottom catching the sunlight at an angle. He accepted that, and we went back to lying on the raft. Then I felt the raft move. Not from the waves. There were no waves. It was more like something had bumped the underside of it. A gentle push upward, enough that I felt it in my back. I sat up and Casey was already sitting up too. We looked at each other. "Did you feel that?" he asked. I said I did. We sat there for a minute waiting. The raft was still. The lake was still. I told myself it was a turtle or a large fish and started to relax. Then it happened again, harder this time. The whole raft shifted, tilted slightly to the left and then settled back. Something underneath us had pushed against it with real force. Casey stood up. He looked at me and I could see he was scared, which scared me, because Casey was never scared of anything. He said we should swim back. I agreed. We got to the edge of the raft and I looked down at the water and hesitated. Whatever had bumped the raft was down there. The idea of getting into that dark water with it made my stomach drop. But what choice did we have? We couldn't stay on a half-rotten raft forever. I lowered myself in first. The water was cold and I couldn't see anything below my waist. Casey got in right after me. We swam for shore. I swam faster than I'd ever swum in my life. I didn't look down. I didn't look back. I just focused on the shoreline ahead and moved my arms and kicked. The whole way in, I kept expecting to feel something brush against my legs, something grabbing my ankle. Every time my foot kicked through the water and hit nothing but water, I felt a surge of relief that lasted about half a second before the fear came back. We made it to shore and scrambled up onto the dock and stood there, dripping and breathing hard. Casey looked at me and said, "What the hell was that?" I said I didn't know. And I didn't. We stood on the dock and watched the lake, which was completely calm and empty and beautiful in the evening light. Nothing surfaced. Nothing rippled. It looked like every other evening at Birch Lake. We didn't swim out to the raft again. We swam near shore for the rest of Casey's visit, in the shallow water where we could see the sandy bottom. Neither of us talked about what happened, not in any serious way. It became one of those things that you mention once, and then let drop, because you don't have an explanation, and talking about it doesn't help. Casey went home at the end of August, and I stayed at the cabin with my parents for one more week. On one of the last days, I was sitting on the dock alone in the late afternoon, just looking at the lake. My parents were up at the cabin making dinner. I wasn't swimming, just dangling my feet off the end of the dock, watching the light change on the water. I looked out toward the raft and something was wrong with it. It took me a second to figure out what. The raft was lower in the water than it should have been. Much lower. It was almost submerged, with just the edges poking above the surface, like something heavy was sitting on top of it, or pulling it down from underneath. As I watched, the raft slipped under. Slowly, smoothly, it went below the surface and disappeared, not tipping over, not breaking apart. It sank straight down, as if it were being drawn into the water by a steady hand. I sat on the dock and watched the spot where the raft had been. The water settled and there was no trace of it. No bubbles, no debris, no foam blocks bobbing to the surface. It was just gone, like it had never existed. I told my dad the raft sank, and he said those things don't last forever, that it probably just got too waterlogged. He said he'd talked to the neighbors about pulling it out of the lake before it became a hazard, but as far as I know, nobody ever found it. The water was too deep, too dark. It was down there somewhere, at the bottom, with whatever else was in that lake. My family sold the cabin a few years later when my parents divorced. I drove past Birch Lake once, maybe 10 years ago, on my way somewhere else. I slowed down and looked at the water through the trees. It looked the same as it always had. Dark and still and deep. Pretty from a distance. I didn't stop. I didn't want to get any closer. I still swim. Pools mostly. Chlorinated water where I can see the drain at the bottom. People think it's a preference. It isn't. My mother died on a Tuesday in March. Pancreatic cancer. She'd been diagnosed in November and was gone by spring, which is how it goes with pancreatic cancer most of the time. Fast and cruel. She was 71. I'm not writing this to talk about her death, though. I'm writing about what happened after. I live in Portland. My mother lived in Tucson. After the funeral, my brother and I spent a week going through her house, sorting her things, dealing with all the paperwork that comes with death. It's exhausting in a specific way, because you're grieving, but you're also constantly making decisions about furniture and bank accounts and who gets what. You don't have time to actually feel anything. My brother took most of the furniture. I took some photos, her jewelry box, a few books. We donated the rest and put the house on the market. I flew home and tried to go back to my normal life. About 2 weeks after I got back to Portland, I got a voicemail. My phone had been on silent during a meeting, and when I checked it afterward, there was one new message. The caller ID said, "Mom." My heart did something funny when I saw that. Her phone had been disconnected. My brother and I had canceled her cell plan the week after the funeral. There was no way she could be calling me. I figured it was a glitch. Telecom systems do weird things sometimes. Maybe the number had already been reassigned, or there was some lag in the cancellation, or it was a spoofed number from a scam call. I almost deleted it without listening. But I didn't. I played the voicemail. It was mostly static, that hissing, crackling sound you get with a bad connection. But underneath the static, just barely audible, there was a voice. I had to press the phone hard against my ear and cover my other ear with my hand to hear it. It was my mother's voice. I know how that sounds. I know grief makes you hear things, makes you desperate to find connections that aren't there. I know all of that. But I knew my mother's voice the way you know the voice of someone you've listened to your entire life. It was her. She was saying something, but I could only make out fragments through the static. It sounded like, "can't find," and then something I couldn't catch, and then what might have been, "please," and then the message ended. I played it again and again, probably 15 times in a row, sitting in the parking garage at my office with the engine off. Each time I heard the same fragments. Each time I became more certain it was her. I called my brother that night. I told him I'd gotten a voicemail from Mom's number. He went quiet for a long time and then asked me what it said. I told him. He asked if I'd saved it. I said yes. He told me to delete it. I asked him why. He said, "Because it's not her. It can't be her. And listening to it over and over is going to mess you up." He was probably right. But I didn't delete it. Over the following days, I played the voicemail a lot. In the morning before work. At night before bed. I'd close my eyes and listen, and try to make out the words I couldn't hear. Sometimes I thought I could hear more than before. Other times it was just static, and I'd wonder if I was imagining the voice entirely. Then I got a second one. Same caller ID, same static. This time the voice was a little clearer. I could hear her say, looking for the, and then a word I couldn't make out, and then, not where I thought, and then the message cut off. My hands were shaking when I put the phone down. This wasn't a telecom glitch. Not twice. Someone or something was leaving me voicemails from my dead mother's disconnected phone number, and the messages sounded like her, confused and searching for something. I called the phone company. The woman I spoke with confirmed that my mother's number had been deactivated and was not currently assigned to any account. She said it was technically impossible for that number to be placing calls. When I told her I'd received 2 voicemails from it, she suggested it might be a spoofing issue and recommended I report it to the FCC. She was polite, but clearly didn't know what to do with what I was telling her. I thought about calling my brother again, but decided not to. I knew what he'd say. The third voicemail came a week later. This time there was almost no static. Her voice was clear. She said, "I can't find the front door. Everything looks different. I don't know where I am." She sounded scared. Not panicked. Just lost and small and scared. The way she sounded the last time I'd visited her in Tucson, when the pain was bad and the morphine was making her confused, and she grabbed my hand and asked me where Dad was. Dad had been dead for 12 years. I sat in my kitchen and cried. I cried in a way I hadn't at the funeral or any time since. Because hearing her voice, scared and confused and reaching out to me, broke something open that I'd been keeping sealed shut. When I was done, I did something I hadn't done before. I called her number back. I don't know what I expected. A message saying the number was disconnected, probably. A robot voice telling me the call could not be completed as dialed. The phone rang. It rang 4 times and then went to voicemail, and I heard my mother's outgoing message. The one she'd recorded years ago that said, "Hi, you've reached Marie. Leave me a message and I'll call you back." I left a message. I said, "Mom, it's David. I don't know if you can hear this. I'm here. You're okay. You don't need to find the front door. You can rest." I don't know why I said that. It came out of me without any planning, like my mouth knew what to say even if my brain didn't. I never got another voicemail from her number after that. I checked obsessively for weeks, but nothing came. Eventually, the number was truly disconnected, because when I tried calling it again a month later, I got the standard message about the number no longer being in service. I still have the 3 voicemails saved on my phone. I don't listen to them anymore. For a while, I thought about having someone analyze the audio, clean it up, try to recover the parts I couldn't hear. But I decided against it. I think some things aren't meant to be examined that closely. I think sometimes you just have to accept what happened and sit with the not knowing. My brother asked me once, a few months later, if I deleted the voicemail. I told him I had. He seemed relieved. I didn't tell him about the other 2 messages, or about calling her back, or about what she said. I keep that to myself. I don't think my mother was haunting me. I don't believe in ghosts, not really. But I believe that love doesn't always follow the rules we think it does. I believe that the connection between a parent and a child is strong enough that maybe, just maybe, something of it persists in ways we don't understand, not as spirits or supernatural forces, but as something quieter and stranger than that. A voicemail from nowhere. A voice on the line. A mother trying to find her way. I think she found it. I hope she did. Right, so the thing about where I live is that it is a completely normal street in a completely normal suburb, and nothing about it would ever make you think twice. I bring that up because people always want a creepy setting when you tell them a story like this. They want an old house, a dark road, fog. There was none of that. It was a street with cul-de-sacs and sprinklers and guys mowing their lawns on Saturday mornings. That's what made it so bad. The Littles moved in next door sometime in June. I didn't catch the exact date because I'd been traveling for work, and when I got back, there they were. A man and a woman, probably late 40s. No kids. They drove a beige Camry. The man was thin and tall with glasses, and the woman was shorter, kind of heavy-set, with brown hair she always wore pulled back. I never learned their first names. They introduced themselves as the Littles, and that was what stuck. Block party in July. They didn't put up block party in July. They didn't put up decorations for the 4th. They kept their blinds closed all the time, which I noticed because nobody else on the street did that. Everyone else had their curtains open and their garage doors up half the day like it was a competition to show how normal and approachable they were. The Littles kept everything shut. I wouldn't have thought much about any of this if it weren't for the sounds. I share a wall with the Littles. Not a wall exactly, but the houses are close together, and my bedroom window faces their side of the house. Starting in maybe late July, I started hearing things at night. Muffled sounds through the wall. Rhythmic, steady, like something being moved back and forth, or someone working at something, pushing or pulling, over and over again. It usually started late and went on for a long time. I could hear it if I was lying in bed with the window cracked for air. Not loud enough to complain about, but loud enough that once I noticed it, I couldn't unnotice it. I assumed it was something boring. Maybe they had exercise equipment. Maybe one of them couldn't sleep and was pacing. Maybe they were rearranging furniture every single night for some reason. People have their habits. Then in August I was out back grilling one evening, and I noticed a smell coming from the Littles' yard. Their backyard was bordered by a 6-foot fence, so I couldn't see in. But the smell was drifting over on the breeze. It was sharp and chemical. Not like pool chemicals or cleaning products. More like something industrial. Acrid. It burned the inside of my nose a little. I mentioned it to my wife and she said she'd smelled it too, a few times, usually in the evening. She figured they were doing some kind of home improvement project. Painting, staining, something like that. That made sense, so I let it go. In September, I was taking the trash out and I saw something in the Littles' garbage that gave me pause. They'd put their bin out for collection, and the lid wasn't fully closed because something was wedged in there. It looked like a plastic tarp, bunched up and stuffed in on top of the regular trash bags. The tarp was stained. Dark stains, reddish-brown, soaked through in patches. I could see it clearly under the streetlight. I looked at it for longer than I should have. Then I took my own trash out and went back inside. A couple things happened that I want to lay out plainly, because I think the combination of them is what matters, not any single one. Mr. Liddell started going out very late at night. I know this because I'm a light sleeper, and my bedroom faces the driveway. I'd hear his car start at 1 or 2 in the morning. He'd come back a couple hours later. This happened maybe twice a week through September and October. I never saw what he was carrying in or out of the car. By the time I'd get to my window, he'd already be inside. The chemical smell kept coming and going, some nights worse than others. The rhythmic sounds at night continued. I started wearing earplugs. One evening in late October, I was walking my dog past the Littles' house, and I looked at their garage. The small window on the side had been covered from the inside with what looked like black plastic sheeting. Every window I could see on the side of the house facing me was the same. Blinds closed, curtains drawn, and now the garage window blacked out. I stood there on the sidewalk with my dog, and I had this feeling that I should do something, but I couldn't articulate what. I hadn't witnessed a crime. I hadn't seen anything definitive. All I had was a list of things that were individually explainable, but collectively wrong. My wife told me I was being paranoid. She said the Littles were private people, and that wasn't a crime. She said I was the one being weird, paying that much attention to what the neighbors were doing. She had a point. I backed off. I stopped looking at their garbage and stopped counting how many times Mr. Liddell left in the middle of the night. Then in November, Mrs. Little disappeared. I don't mean she went missing dramatically. I mean I stopped seeing her. No more waves at the mailbox. No more car in the driveway except Mr. Liddell's. He still came and went on his schedule, but she was just gone. After 2 weeks of not seeing her, I asked Mr. Little about it. We were both getting our mail at the same time. I said something casual like, "Haven't seen your wife around lately. Hope she's doing okay." He looked at me. He had this way of looking at you, where his face was completely still. No expression at all. Not friendly, not hostile, just blank. He said she'd gone to stay with her sister in Michigan for a while. Family stuff. Then he went inside. I looked up property records for the house. I don't know what I was looking for. The house was owned by an LLC. The Littles weren't on any of the paperwork. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? My neighbor is quiet and keeps to himself, and his wife went to visit her sister. The chemical smell, the garbage, none of it was evidence of anything. In early December, a smell started coming from the Littles' side of the property that was different from the chemical one. It was organic, sweet and dense and wrong, like meat left out in the sun, but stronger. It was worse near the fence between our yards. I called the police. I told them I was concerned about a strong smell coming from my neighbor's property, and that I hadn't seen one of the residents in several weeks. They sent someone out the next day. A single officer who knocked on the Littles' door and talked to Mr. Little for about 10 minutes on the porch. I watched from my window. The officer seemed casual. Mr. Little seemed calm. The officer left. Nothing happened. 2 days later, the Littles' house was empty. Beige Camry gone. Blinds still closed. No forwarding address, no goodbye, no notice. The house just sat there, closed up and quiet. It sat empty for 2 months before the landlord came by to inspect it. I know because I saw the locksmith and the landlord going in, and I went over and introduced myself and asked what was going on. The landlord said the tenants had broken their lease and left. I asked him if everything looked okay inside. He gave me a strange look and said he'd just gotten there. I said okay, and went home and waited. An hour later, there were 3 police cars on the street. I never found out exactly what they found in that house. It wasn't in the news. Whatever the investigation turned up, it wasn't made public. The landlord had the place professionally cleaned. Some company came with a van and equipment and spent 3 days in there. The house went back on the market in the spring. A young couple with a baby bought it. They're nice. They keep their curtains open. I think about Mrs. Liddell sometimes. I wonder if she really went to Michigan. I wonder if the police ever found the Liddells. I wonder what was in that house that required a professional cleaning crew and 3 days of work. Mostly I think about how long I waited. How many signs there were that something was deeply wrong. And how I kept explaining each one away because the alternative seemed impossible. Things like that don't happen on streets like mine. Except apparently they do. And the ordinariness of the setting is what lets them happen. Nobody suspects anything because there is nothing to suspect. It all looks normal. The lawn is mowed. The car is beige. The neighbors wave. My uncle has 80 acres of timber in the Ozarks, most of it steep rocky hillsides covered in oak and hickory. He runs trail cameras out there year-round, mainly to track deer movement for hunting season. He's got maybe 10 cameras scattered across the property, strapped to trees along trails and near the creek beds where the deer come to drink. Every few weeks he'll swap out the SD cards and look through the photos on his computer. It's mostly deer, turkeys, the occasional coyote. Standard wildlife stuff. He called me last October and asked if I could come help him with the cameras. He's in his 60s, and the terrain is hard on his knees, so I usually go out there a few times a year to help him with the physical stuff. I said sure and drove out that weekend. We spent Saturday morning hiking the property and swapping cards. It was a good day for it, cool and clear, the leaves just starting to turn. The woods were quiet. We got to all 10 cameras without any issues and headed back to the house around noon. After lunch, my uncle started going through the photos on his laptop. I was sitting next to him, half paying attention, drinking a beer. He was clicking through the usual stuff. Deer at dawn, deer at dusk, a raccoon walking along a fallen log, a blurry photo of what was probably a bobcat. He got to camera 7 and started scrolling. Camera 7 was the one deepest into the property, on a hillside overlooking a dry creek bed about a quarter mile from the nearest road. It was also the most remote camera to get to, which is one of the reasons he asked for my help. The first few hundred photos were normal. Then he stopped scrolling. The image on the screen showed the creek bed at night, the camera's infrared flash turning everything that washed out gray-green color. In the middle of the frame, standing in the creek bed, there was a person. They were facing the camera, standing completely upright and still. The photo was clear enough that I could see they were wearing dark clothing, maybe jeans and a jacket. I couldn't make out the face because of the angle and the infrared wash, but the posture was wrong. Not standing the way a person normally stands. The arms were hanging at the sides but slightly away from the body, the head tilted a few degrees to the right. It looked like someone had arranged a mannequin in the woods. My uncle said nothing. He clicked to the next photo. The trail camera takes photos in bursts of 3 when it detects motion. Same figure, same position, maybe a second later. No change at all. Not even a slight shift in posture or a blur from breathing. Completely motionless. Third photo. Same. Exactly the same. Like looking at a statue. My uncle clicked to the next burst, taken about 4 minutes later. The creek bed was empty. The person was gone, I asked my uncle if he had any trespassers on the property. He said sometimes kids from town came out to party in the woods, but never this deep in. There's no easy access to where Camera 7 sits. You'd have to cross 2 barbed wire fences and hike through a half-mile of thick brush with no trail. He went back to the photo, and we both looked at it more carefully. The more I looked, the more unsettled I got. The figure's proportions seemed a little off to me, but I couldn't pin down why. It might have been the infrared distortion. Infrared does strange things to images, blows out light surfaces, and makes shadows look deeper than they are. I told myself it was that. My uncle saved the photos and we went through the rest of the cameras. Nothing unusual on any of the others. I drove home the next day and mostly forgot about it. Figured it was a trespasser, maybe a poacher, maybe someone lost. Creepy to see on a trail camera, but not unexplainable. 3 weeks later, my uncle called again. He'd swapped the cards again, and Camera 7 had picked up something new. Minutes later, showed the figure closer to the creek bed, same as before. Same position, same tilt of the head. The second burst, 8 minutes later, showed the figure closer to the camera, maybe 20 feet closer. Same posture, same absolute stillness. Third burst, 11 minutes after the second, closer again. The face was more visible now, and this is the part that I keep coming back to. The face didn't look right. It was a face. It had the features you'd expect, but something about it was flat. Like a mask, but not a mask. The eyes reflected the infrared flash the way animal eyes do. Bright white points in the gray-green image. Human eyes don't do that. Animal eyes do because of the tapetum lucidum, the reflective layer behind the retina. Humans don't have that. Fourth burst, closer, maybe 10 feet from the camera. Same posture, same face. The eyes were the brightest things in the image. Fifth burst, 6 minutes later. The frame was empty. Sixth burst, 2 minutes after the fifth. The camera had taken a photo, but it was pointed at the sky, like something had grabbed the camera and tilted it upward. The strap was still around the tree. My uncle confirmed that when he went out to check. When he got to Camera 7 to check on it, the camera was fine, still strapped to the tree, still functioning. But it was pointed about 30 degrees higher than where he'd aimed it. Something had pushed it, hard enough to change the angle, but not hard enough to break the strap or the mount. My uncle is not a nervous guy. He's lived in those hills his whole life, and he's comfortable in the woods in a way that I've never been. But he told me on the phone that he wasn't going back to that part of the property alone. He said the thing in the photos wasn't a person, and he didn't know what it was, but he didn't want to find out. He moved Camera 7 to a different location, closer to the house. He left the creek bed spot empty. For the rest of hunting season, he avoided that part of the property entirely. I went back out in December to help him check fences. We walked most of the property, but we didn't go near the old Camera 7 spot. He didn't suggest it, and neither did I. We talked about other things. Football, his truck, the new roof he was getting. On the drive home, I kept thinking about the eyes in those photos, the way they reflected the infrared. I looked it up when I got home, just to confirm what I already knew. Human eyes don't reflect like that. They just don't. So either there was something wrong with the camera, some glitch that made normal eyes look reflective, or whatever was standing in that creek bed and walking toward the camera, in careful increments through the night, was not a person. My uncle still runs his cameras, He still hunts on the property. But there's a section of those 80 acres that he doesn't go to anymore. And when I visit, I don't ask about it. Some places in the woods belong to whatever lives there, and the best thing you can do is leave them alone. I found the listing on one of those vacation rental sites in February. A cabin in the Cascades, Eastern Washington, available for a week in early March, at a price that was almost suspiciously low. The photos showed a small A-frame surrounded by pines, a wood stove in the living room, a deck overlooking a creek. It looked exactly like the kind of place I needed after the year I'd had. Divorce finalized in October. Moved out of the house in November. Spent December and January in a one-bedroom apartment that smelled like the previous tenant's cigarettes. I wanted a week alone somewhere clean and quiet. The cabin seemed perfect. The drive out took about 4 hours from Seattle. The last stretch was a gravel Forest Service road that wound up through the trees for about 6 miles. No cell service once I turned off the highway. The host had warned me about that in the listing. She'd also left detailed directions because GPS didn't work reliably out there. Turn left at the green gate, follow the road past the clearing, take the right fork at the big stump. That kind of thing. I arrived in the late afternoon. The cabin looked like the photos, maybe a little more weathered. The key was in a lockbox on the porch. I let myself in and did a quick walkthrough. Kitchen, living room with the wood stove, small bathroom, loft bedroom up a ladder. Everything was clean. There were fresh towels and a binder on the kitchen counter with instructions for the wood stove, the water pump, and the propane. A handwritten note from the host said to enjoy my stay and to call her if I needed anything, though she acknowledged that calling would require driving back down to the highway for signal. I unpacked, got a fire going, made dinner from the groceries I'd brought. By 8 o'clock it was fully dark outside. No moon. The kind of darkness that people who live in cities forget exists, where you literally cannot see your hand in front of your face. I stood on the deck for a minute and listened. Wind in the pines. The creek somewhere below. Nothing else. I went to bed early and slept better than I had in months. The first 2 days were great. I hiked during the day, read by the fire at night. I didn't think about my ex-wife or the apartment or any of the things that had been grinding me down. The solitude felt therapeutic. I talked to nobody. I saw nobody. The nearest neighbor was apparently several miles away according to the binder. On the third morning, I went for a long hike along the creek. I followed it upstream for maybe 2 miles, picking my way over rocks and fallen trees. The forest was dense, mostly Douglas fir and western red cedar, old growth in some sections, the trunks wider than my arm span. Beautiful country. I was heading back toward the cabin around noon when I noticed something off the trail. About 30 yards into the trees, partially hidden by underbrush, there was a structure. Not a building exactly. More like a lean-to, built from branches and tarps, tucked between 2 large trees. It was crude but deliberate. Someone had constructed it. I stopped and looked at it from the trail. It didn't look abandoned. The tarps were intact, not sun-bleached or torn. There were items around the base that I couldn't fully make out from where I was standing. I thought about going closer, but something about it made me uneasy. Not the structure itself so much as the fact that it was out here at all. This was supposed to be remote, unoccupied forest. The listing had emphasized the isolation as a selling point. I went back to the cabin and didn't think too much about it. People camp in national forests all the time. Hikers, hunters, sometimes homeless folks looking for a place away from everything. It didn't have to mean anything. That night I was reading by the fire when I heard something outside. A branch snapping, loud and sharp, close to the cabin. I put my book down and listened. Another snap, then a rustling sound, like something moving through the brush near the deck. I got up and turned on the porch light. It illuminated maybe 15 feet of the deck and the trees immediately beyond it. I didn't see anything. I stood at the window and watched for a few minutes. The rustling had stopped. I told myself it was a deer or a raccoon and went back to my book. An hour later, I climbed up to the loft to go to bed. The loft had a small window that faced the back of the property, away from the deck. I glanced out of it while I was getting undressed and stopped. There was a light in the trees. Not close, maybe a couple 100 yards away, up the slope behind the cabin. A faint yellowish light, steady, not flickering like a campfire would. It was just there, a small point of warm light in the absolute darkness of the forest. I watched it for a long time. It didn't move. It didn't go out. I couldn't tell what it was. A lantern, maybe. A headlamp left on. It was in the general direction of where I'd seen the lean-to, though I wasn't sure of the exact distance or angle. I went to bed and lay there thinking about it. Someone was out there, not far from the cabin, in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night, with a light on. I slept, but not well. The next morning I looked out the loft window first thing. No light, just trees and gray sky. I ate breakfast and debated with myself about what to do. I had 3 more days on the rental. I didn't want to cut my trip short because of what was probably just a camper. But the unease from the night before hadn't gone away. If anything, it had settled in deeper. I decided to hike back up to where I'd seen the lean-to. In daylight, with my boots on and my head clear, it seemed like the sensible thing to do. See what was there. Satisfy myself that it was nothing. I found the spot easily enough. The lean-to was still there, but it had changed since the day before. The tarps had been rearranged. Items that had been scattered around the base were now organized. And there were new things. A plastic jug of water, a coil of rope, a pair of work gloves laid out neatly on a flat rock, and photographs. Someone had pinned photographs to one of the tarps with thumbtacks. I moved closer and looked at them. They were printed on regular paper, inkjet quality, slightly warped from moisture. There were maybe a dozen of them. They were photos of the cabin. My cabin, taken from different angles and distances. The front porch, the deck, the kitchen window. One was taken from what must have been very close to the cabin, because it showed the interior through the living room window. I could see the wood stove, the couch, the book I'd left on the armrest. One photo showed the loft window at night. The window was lit from inside. I could see a figure silhouetted in the window, looking out. It was me, standing at the window the night before, looking at the light in the trees. Someone had been watching me, close enough to photograph me through the windows, close enough to see what book I was reading, and they'd printed the photos and brought them here and pinned them up. I backed away from the lean-to. My hands were tingling and my mouth was dry. I walked back to the trail, and then I walked very fast back to the cabin. I went inside and locked the door and the windows. I packed my bag. It took me about 10 minutes to get everything together and into the car. Before I left, I looked around the exterior of the cabin. On the back wall, beneath the loft window, there were footprints in the soft ground. Boot prints. Large, deep impressions. Someone had stood there recently, right under the window, looking up. I drove down the gravel road faster than I should have. When I got to the highway and my phone picked up signal, I had 6 missed calls from the host. I pulled over and called her back. Told her he'd seen someone walking the Forest Service road near the cabin. She said there had been problems before. A man had been living rough in the forest near the property for the past year. She said he was not dangerous as far as she knew, but that he had issues, and that previous guests had reported finding him near the cabin at night. She said she was sorry, and that she should have told me sooner. I asked her what she meant by issues. That he'd stayed in the area. In the forest, near the cabin. She said he seemed to believe the cabin was still his. I asked her if she'd called the police. She said she had several times, but there wasn't much they could do. He wasn't technically trespassing on her property. The forest was public land. Standing in the woods wasn't a crime. I told her about the photographs. She went quiet again. Then she said she'd contact the sheriff's office and asked me to send her the details. I said I would. I drove home. I sent an email to the host with everything that had happened. I left a review on the rental site, factual and brief, mentioning the situation. The listing was taken down about a week later. I think about it sometimes. Not the photographs or the footprints, though those were bad enough. What gets me is the window. Me standing at that loft window in the dark, looking out at a light in the trees, thinking I was the one watching. And the whole time, someone was right below me, close enough to touch the wall of the cabin, looking up at me from the darkness. I was never the one watching. I was always the one being watched. I just didn't know it yet. I need to tell someone what happened with Caroline, and I guess this is how I am going to do it. I have not told this story to anyone in full because every time I start, I can hear how it sounds and I stop. But it happened. All of it happened, and I need to get it down somewhere outside of my own head before it drives me crazy. Maybe it already has. I honestly cannot tell anymore. Caroline was my grandmother on my mother's side. She died when I was 9 years old, and I barely remember her. What I do remember is scattered and not particularly useful. She had white hair. She smelled like lavender. She lived in a house in Savannah with green shutters and a porch that wrapped around the whole front. She called me Sugar. That is the full extent of my memories of Caroline. My mother was not close with her. They had some kind of falling out before I was born that my mother refused to discuss. When Caroline died, my mother went to the funeral alone and came back after 2 days, and that was that. She inherited the house in Savannah but never went back. She hired a property manager to maintain it and rent it out and collected a check every month and never set foot in Georgia again. My mother died 6 years ago and I inherited the house. I'm 34. The property manager had retired by then, and the house had been sitting empty for about a year. I flew down to Savannah to deal with it, figuring I would sell it. The house was in rough shape, not destroyed, but neglected. The kind of wear you get when nobody lives in a place and nobody cares about it enough to stay on top of things. Peeling paint, overgrown yard, a leak in the upstairs bathroom that had warped the floor. The porch was still there though, still wrapped around the front, and the shutters were still green, faded to a pale mint color by decades of sun. I planned to spend a few days cleaning it out, and then list it. I got a room at a hotel downtown, but ended up spending most of my time at the house, sorting through what was left inside. The renters had used their own furniture, so what remained was Caroline's stuff, pushed into closets in the attic. Old clothes, old books, kitchen things, a sewing machine, boxes of photographs. The photographs were what slowed me down. I'd never seen most of them. My mother had kept almost nothing from her childhood, and I knew very little about Caroline's life. The photos showed a woman I didn't recognize from my few memories. Young Caroline, dark-haired and serious-looking, standing in front of the house when it was new. Caroline with a man I assumed was my grandfather, who died before I was born. Caroline holding a baby that must have been my mother. There were dozens of them, spanning what looked like 40 or 50 years. In one box I found something different. A journal, leather-bound, about the size of a paperback, filled with Caroline's handwriting. The entries were dated and went from 1987 to 1994, the last one written about 3 months before she died. I should not have read it. I know that now. Some things belong to the dead and should stay with them. But I was curious about this woman I barely knew. This grandmother my mother had cut off. And so I sat on the floor of the attic with the box of photographs next to me and I read. The early entries were ordinary. Daily life, gardening, church. A friend named Delia who came for lunch on Wednesdays. References to my mother that were brief and sad. Things like called Margaret, she did not answer, or sent a birthday card to the baby, no response. The baby was me. In 1989, the entries changed. Caroline began writing about a visitor. She described waking up in the middle of the night and finding a woman sitting in the chair in the corner of her bedroom. She wrote that the woman was young, maybe 25, with dark hair and a pale face. She was wearing a dress that Caroline described as old-fashioned, not antique exactly, but dated, like something from the 40s or 50s. The woman was just sitting there, hands folded in her lap, watching Caroline sleep. Caroline wrote that she was not frightened. She wrote that the woman felt familiar, though she could not say why. She did not get up or speak to the woman. She lay in bed and watched her, and eventually fell back asleep. When she woke in the morning, the chair was empty. The woman came back. According to the journal, she appeared every few weeks over the next several years, always in the same chair, always at night, always sitting quietly with her hands folded. Caroline began to write about her matter-of-factly, the way you'd mention a neighbor stopping by. She was here again last night. Or, the visitor came, stayed about an hour. In 1991, Caroline wrote something that made me put the journal down and sit there for a long time. She wrote, "I realize now who she is. She looks exactly like Margaret did in her 20s. The same face. But it is not Margaret. I think it is someone who has not been born yet." My mother's name was Margaret, Caroline went on. She wrote that the woman in the chair resembled her daughter, but was not her daughter. She speculated in her careful handwriting that the visitor might be a grandchild, or a great-grandchild, or some relative from a time she would not live to see. She wrote that she did not find this disturbing. She found it comforting. I am 34 years old. I look like my mother. People have told me this my whole life. When my mother was 25, we could have been twins. I have dark hair. I have a face that people call pale. These are facts. I finished reading the journal that evening. The last entries were sparse. Caroline's health was declining, and her handwriting was getting worse. The final entry, dated June 1994, said only, "She came again. I wish she would speak. I have so much I want to tell her." Caroline died in September of that year. I put the journal back in the box. I finished cleaning out the house over the next 2 days. I did not stay overnight. I went back to the hotel every evening before dark, and I did not return to the house until morning. I was not going to sit in that house at night. I was not going to risk falling asleep in a chair in a bedroom where my dead grandmother might look at me and recognize someone who had not yet come to visit her. Here is the part that I cannot explain, and that I have not told anyone. On my last night in Savannah, I was lying in my hotel room trying to sleep. The hotel was modern, clean, anonymous. Nothing like Caroline's house. I was on the 7th floor with the curtains drawn and the air conditioning humming, as impersonal a space as you could ask for. I opened my eyes because something felt wrong. The room was dark except for the light leaking around the edges of the curtains from the parking lot below. Everything looked normal, but the air felt different, thicker somehow, and there was a smell, faint but unmistakable. Lavender. I lay still and looked at the corner of the room near the window. There was an armchair there, the kind hotels put in rooms that nobody ever sits in. I looked at the chair, and the chair was empty, and I told myself I was being ridiculous. Grief in old journals and an overactive imagination. Nothing more. But the lavender smell stayed. It hung in the air for a long time. I lay there breathing it in, this smell from my childhood that I had not encountered in 25 years. And I felt something I cannot adequately describe. Not fear, not comfort exactly. Something between the two. A recognition, a sense of being known by someone I could not see. I did not sleep that night. I caught the first flight out in the morning. I sold the house. A young couple from Atlanta bought it. I kept the journal. It sits in a drawer in my bedroom, underneath socks and old receipts. I have not opened it again. What I think about, when I let myself think about it, is the loop. Caroline saw a woman in a chair who looked like a relative from the future. I read about it 30 years later and became terrified of being that woman. But if I had never read the journal, I would never have known about the chair, and none of this would have any meaning. The journal created the connection it described. Or maybe the connection was always there, and the journal just made me aware of it. I do not know which version is worse, that I am caught in something that was waiting for me before I was born, or that I built the trap myself by reading a dead woman's private thoughts. Either way, I do not sit in chairs in dark rooms anymore. I do not wear old-fashioned dresses. I do not fold my hands in my lap. I have made these adjustments to my life without telling anyone why, and if people notice, they do not ask. The lavender smell comes back sometimes. at odd moments, in places where there is no lavender. I will be in a grocery store or at my desk at work, and suddenly it is there, strong and sweet and unmistakable. It lasts for a few seconds and then it is gone. When it happens, I do not look around. I keep my eyes forward. I do not want to see who might be watching.